virtual committee meeting. I'd like to call to order the Special Environment Committee for June 3rd, 2020. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nation. And is there any late items?
Yes, we have one late item. So agenda item 5A. On your agenda, it's noted that Rob is giving a presentation, but it's actually David Reed from Leonard Consulting.
Okay. Somebody to move the adoption of the agenda.
Is everyone here?
Video screen usually on there?
Yeah, maybe we'll just stop sharing this screen for now and we can see everyone.
All right, I can see you all again. Anybody would like to move the adoption of the agenda?
Wally Wells, I'll move it.
All right, moved by Wally, seconded by... Go for it, Jerome.
Sure, I'll second it. Yeah, anything, let's go.
Great, second by Jerome, all in favor? Carried. Anybody like to move the adoption of the minutes?
I'm on a roll, yes.
Moved by Jerome, seconded by
There's Darren.
Darren. All in favor? Carried. All right, that brings us to item 5A, climate action integration with the Reimagine Nanaimo process. So I'd like to welcome David Reed, in the sunny Nanaimo Commercial Street. Welcome, David.
Great, nice to be here, thanks. I guess if it's time to proceed with the presentation, I will share my screen. I'll do that from here. You can tell me if and when you can actually see the slides. Let me know when you see them there.
We see them here.
Okay, great. So the very first thing, of course, is we are rebranding to Reimagine Nanaimo, and so the slides have not been rebranded yet. They were in your agenda before that happened. I'm pleased to say we had a great session yesterday with staff, and we have some new ideas that staff will be bringing forward to council within the next few days. And so the next time you see materials, they will be Reimagine Nanaimo, and that's what we're proceeding on, and we're pleased with that. But we'll use the deck we had. And I'm going to go through this quite quickly. There's at least 2 councillors involved here, and they have seen this exact presentation, and some staff have. But it is, well, I shouldn't say exact, there's additional material here. We're here to talk about the relationship between an integrated set of plans that are going on and climate change adaptation. And actually, this topic is dear to me, so I'm the one giving this presentation out of our team. Let's see if I can get slides to change, which may be a challenge. Okay, the first technical difficulty. It worked when we tested it, and now it's not. Okay.
Looks like we have questions in chat. I don't know what that is.
I'm just trying various buttons here to see what will work. And then... Oh,
You got
something
it?
happened. All right. There we go. There we go. All right. So the plans that are involved, there's 6 of them. And so the OTP update is one of the primary ones, the Official Community Plan. But at the same time, we're looking at the Parks, Rec, and Culture Plan, the Active Transportation Plan, this plan, the Climate Action Plan, and then in parallel, there's the Economic Development Plan that others are doing, and the Water Supply Strategic Plan that again, others are doing. Leonard's assignment is to coordinate the engagement on all of those, and also to be involved with staff to rewrite the OCP update and the Parks, Rec, and Culture update. So it's quite an undertaking and a unique opportunity, actually. Historically, we used to plan where there. Sorry, a little hitch. That's all right. I'm back. Historically, we would plan, in quite a linear way. We set the desired future, and then we'd imagine a fairly straightforward set of actions and steps that would get us there. Right now, not just with COVID-19, but with other changes in the world, the actions and steps, we really have to adapt. Adapt's the key word. There's going to be things happen that we don't anticipate. Climate change is going to show up in ways that are going to surprise us, probably, sometimes positively, often negatively. But there's also economic shocks that we're seeing right now with COVID-19 and any number of other surprises. So planning these days still wants to know what the desired future state is. So I think we need to work together to define that very clearly with the broader community. But the action items are likely going to be highly adaptive. It's a new way of thinking. I'm going to talk a little bit now about work from a colleague that's in our consulting team. The company is called C2MP. There are 3 of them, but they're specialists actually in both greenhouse gas mitigation and in climate action plans. And so they will be joining us in future meetings. I'm covering for them today just to introduce the topic. And so this is their work. They've been doing a lot of work in southern Vancouver Island. This is a Sydney example, and also in the Lower Mainland. And they have offices in both places. Maybe they'll be in Nanaimo in the future. They developed a web-based tool called CanTool, and done a lot of research over the years as to how to populate the data behind that. The idea of CanTool is it's a way to allow a discussion or support a discussion about community values or changes in the way communities are designed or operated, and how that translates into increases or decreases in greenhouse gases. And so it's designed in a way that will help us look at options as we go ahead and evaluate what mix of options are the best fit for Nanaimo or for neighborhoods in Nanaimo. It's in different parts, so I'm going to show you a few screens here that will give you a little tour of the elements. But certainly one of the keys is the graph on the right, which looks at what happens with greenhouse gases if you do nothing, or what happens with it if you make various changes. So it's a predictive tool. When you look at the B, T, R, and W, the 4 main components of greenhouse gas emissions are building, transportation, renewable energy, and waste. And so CanTool looks at
he's frozen.
David, can you hear us?
Are you okay there? Just to check.
Yeah, you had frozen, but you're back on now.
I'm back now?
Yep, you are.
Okay, thanks. There was a little internet glitch for a moment. So the options are geographically tied. They look at different neighborhood types, different land use types, and different growth models to combine all that with greenhouse gas. This is an example of applying it in central Saanich, Saanich, the central part of Saanich. And so they did work with stakeholders like yourselves and define the feasibility and desirability of different strategies for changes that would lead to greenhouse gas benefits, and also identify the barriers and choose together what actions were suitable. This is the range of ingredients, the menu of ingredients that can make a change, and these were percentages for Saanich. They'll be different in Nanaimo, but perhaps this gives you some indication. So when you look at applying better energy standards, which is in the British Columbia Step Code, that's gradually increasing the amount of investment in reduced energy, 4%, whereas retrofits of existing buildings, maybe almost 12%, envelope retrofits, almost 4%. active transportation just under 3, transit just under 7. Electric vehicle conversion may be much higher, up at over 22%. Renewable fuels about 5%. Solar PV, unfortunately, very little. And then things you might not think of: waste reduction 4.3%, and reduction in just consumption 14%. These are the range of things that we're going to be talking about. As you can see, it's very broad. Sorry, you slipped me back and forth. So this is translating those ingredients into the graph, which shows along the top what would happen if there was no greenhouse gas reduction, and then the various ingredients in building changes and transportation changes that get down to a target of almost 0 emissions by 2050. Just a couple more slides on this. One of the issues for a place like Nanaimo, where there's growth and land use change, but it's not gigantic scale, is that
David,
most of the
are you amenable to taking questions throughout the presentation, or would you like them at the end?
Go ahead.
All right, I just see Jerome with his hand raised there.
Okay.
So, this may be coming up in your slides. I'm wondering how you're factoring in things like the fundamental planning of the city. So if you're saying, transit is reducing by this much, or electric vehicles, what about the fundamental need to move less because your city is built with higher density and you're not sprawling as much?
Absolutely, and so the slide that's in front of you now is getting to that topic. So one of the large ingredients over the long term is the organization of the city and the official community plan and its land use designations and the mix of uses and the density of uses that promote more active transportation and other options, walking and that sort of thing. Absolutely, that's a part of it. That's the huge opportunity. The huge challenge is that the amount of land use change that will happen between now and 2050 probably isn't fast enough. And so we need to do that, and we also need to look at other ingredients, maybe like accelerating switches to electric vehicles to meet the target. So these will be the trade-offs. What can we do long term? What can we do with land use? What can we do with other levers? And it's the mix of those levers that we'll be trying to get to in depth. This is typical lifespan of urban elements, and as you can see, things like infrastructure are 100 years plus, 50 years for roads, 40 years for building envelopes, but personal vehicles are 15 years, appliances are 10. So when you think about that lifespan, that comes into the discussion about, okay, what can we change fast, what can we change more gradually? It doesn't mean that reinventing your city to have a much better distribution of land use and form isn't worth doing. It's just that it might have a longer term effect than other actions. Having said that, we know that climate change and greenhouse gases are going to be an issue for centuries. We all talk about year 2100 or 100 years. We know that they go on for centuries. So it's an interesting challenge for very long-term planning. And so in this, everyone in Nanaimo has a voice, so I'm going back to our overall engagement program. The idea is to build on the Community Engagement Task Force and what its final report recommends, which is to recognize that this isn't just, this level of engagement is going to be much more than just a single contact. The ask for today was how would climate action planning relate to the overall Reimagine the Nanaimo process. And so the process has these rings that go towards a goal. We start with Council's mandate. We'll be starting as soon as possible. Well, it's likely the end of June, with a conversation with the general community to help them tell us where there might be new ideas, what the issues are, where gaps might be. It's a very open conversation about gathering ideas. that will involve many steps, and I'll describe those as we go. Very early in the fall, we'll be looking at options. How might we achieve our climate targets? How might we achieve many, many other objectives? And I'll be talking at the end about some very key framing options workshops that we'd like representatives from your committee to be at. And then in late fall, winter, we will evaluate those options with both technically and with the community and try and figure out what the best mix of actions are for Nanaimo. And then finally, we're planning on next spring having draft recommendations and taking that forward. But alluding back to the idea that there is a certain amount of chaos in planning, the actual process is circuitous, and we recognize that given COVID-19, it'll likely be even more unpredictable than normal. So we're starting. I'll describe the thoughts behind starting, but we recognize that we'll be refining along the way. So it's a journey. It's not a purely linear process. Trying to make it as simple as possible, here's a summary of the startup and then 3 phases. I mentioned the first one now gathering ideas, the second one exploring options, and finally developing plans and recommendations. There is a detailed engagement plan, and I'm only going to hit the high points, but one of the key ideas is that there will be this listening session. There will be a statistically valid public survey as a part of that, as well as many stakeholder events, all of them online, so that we can get a good idea of what the community is thinking now. There will be a second statistically valid survey when we have options, so that we can hear the community's priorities on options. So there's 2 of those key events. But to inform those, we're suggesting that there be, after we end the gathering ideas phase, that there be a framing options workshop, likely early this fall, where we work with staff and key stakeholders to define 2 or 3 different options, different approaches. But then we want a period of time to take that to our technical experts, like Duncan Cavins, the C2MP, and say, for instance, if we had option A, B, and C, what's the difference in greenhouse gas prediction or climate adaptation impacts for each of those? And that's a technical question. And then we wish to come back to a second event, major event that would involve council and probably key staff and stakeholders to explore those results and refine the options before we take them out to the general public. That's the more technical part of our process, but then there are many, many less technical communications along the way. This graph confused council a little bit. The idea is that the dots around the boxes show the kinds of involvement with the public that we are envisioning, whereas the empower boxes on the right-hand side are things that would be beyond this process. We want to make it very clear that the final decision maker in this is council. They represent the city and the public and need to make the hard decisions. But we are anticipating a range of, from informed, consultant, involved, and collaborate participation with the stakeholders and the general public. So our engagement aims are broad. They're both information out, educating the public and generating awareness, but also listening very carefully to values, trying to be inclusive. We're trying to reach the hard to reach. And so our audiences are everyone from the very broad general public who may have a very limited attention span to others like interest groups or other levels of government, certainly staff and elected officials and stakeholders like yourself that will have increasing levels of interest and wish for involvement. It's a complex thing to reach all of those, and now we're trying to do this with physical distancing. So we have been through, with staff and council, an adaptation of what would be a more pre-COVID process that would balance print, digital, and word-of-mouth tools to a reliance that has all of those, but a greater reliance on digital that we're doing right now. But we do need to use a lot of different levers to raise awareness. There's no use in doing this process in a vacuum. We need to communicate fairly loudly to get everyone involved. And so we will be having a lot of use of custom web pages and something that's already up called Get Involved Nanaimo. There will be social media that's moderated. The city is producing some video shorts, and we will have print media releases, various kinds of contests to involve youth and the cultural community, and getting into a lot of the other stakeholder groups and their list of stakeholders so that we can reach out through them, like yourselves. There will be some print materials that might be up with static displays to attract attention. Not a lot of this, but some. There will be some prizes for participation. Even Parks has in the past paid some key representatives to spend a couple hours in nominal amounts. But really, really important is word of mouth. So stakeholder groups like yourselves have your own contacts that are interested, and we absolutely encourage you to use those networks to help us get people involved. We are involving VIU Planning School, and we'll involve the university. We have talked through staff to the school district, and they are keen to have this be a part of their networks as well. So a wide range of engagement. When we look at this first phase, which is gathering ideas, the things I mentioned are all a part of what we'll be doing. We've been adapting them for COVID-19. So the digital elements stay the same as before. The face-to-face elements we're going to adapt to online as much as we can. And the community stations and stakeholder interviews and those sorts of things will also will go ahead but be adapted. Get Involved Nanaimo is a platform that's already established. It's using software called Bang the Table, but it is designed to help the community be able to communicate back and forth with the city on many different issues, but we'll make heavy use of that for these various plans. It allows us to give information out, to take polls, to have people tell stories, to do online surveys, to support forums online, to even have people put things on a map or do a question and answer, and it also allows for moderation. We would never go into Facebook or that sort of thing without some moderation of the discussion. We'll be using various social media, mainly for information out. And then for pop-ups, we were originally planning to have a lot of small events out in the community. Those will have to be shifting to have more at-home events and digitally based. I mentioned that there will be mail-out surveys. The idea of the mail-out survey is to make sure that it's getting to a broad range of participants and is statistically valid. But there'll also be community questionnaires that are more self-selected that will not be statistically valid, but still a way for people to respond. And interesting always to compare those non-statistical results with the valid ones and see if they align. In our experience, they often do. But there can be cases where certain stakeholders are trying to push their agenda that might not match the statistical results. So it's great to have both. The original idea was to have large forums, of course, and that will have to change. If there will be online question and answer series. You've seen CBC doing that, quite effective. Maybe small group chats where we can have a group like this and still have an online meeting. There might be special speakers who give video lectures and, of course, interactive websites. The static stations we'll be looking for places outdoors. There'll be a lot that's outdoors. I heard the conversation, downtowns and various stores are starting to open up a bit again. There's a lot of patio. So maybe we'll be looking at how we might relate to those. And then stakeholder meetings and interviews like this one, I am presenting today, but there'll be other sessions for where I want to listen mostly. So groups like yourselves are going to be really important to be a part of this. There also will likely be, of course, a digital toolbox, frequently asked questions, ways for people to ask questions and get answers. So that's detailed, but this is back to the summary of the overall process. I mentioned this idea of a framing options workshop. It's likely September. I understand you have a meeting September 9th, and I'll be thinking and talking with staff about how that might relate to this framing options workshop. So we'll be starting to schedule the fall, thinking now. Ideally, we find an online way to use the CAN tool that I described earlier and have a discussion about priorities and values and options for Nanaimo with all those factors. And then, as I mentioned, after that, after setting up the options, we would go away and test how effective they might be in terms of greenhouse gases in particular and climate adaptation as well. But the key point is that that's going to the climate action is going to be integrated in this case, which is special space with land use, with transportation, with transit, with technology choice on vehicles and building and the energy step code, with parks and recreation. It's a one in a lifetime chance actually to look at all these factors all at once. As Duncan of C2MP tells me, usually they get to do a greenhouse gas plan, but people will say, but we can't change the official plan or we can't change transportation. We have to live with those. And this is a rare case where we're planning them all at once. So with that, I'll stop and open it for questions and say thank you.
Thank you, David. So open it up here, questions for folks. You want to raise your little blue hand, that's the easiest way, and if you haven't figured that one out yet, just wave frantically and we'll spot you. So I've got Wally. Go ahead, Wally.
Thank you. I had to unmute my microphone. As pleased as I am to hear this, I'm very concerned about the silo and the limitations. Climate action goes way beyond greenhouse gases. We recently published climate action and asset management. I've been doing work with the province on their website. The new RDN committee is engaging way more than greenhouse gases, and you're quite right. We have the ability to integrate all of these things, but if you look at Cache Creek at the moment, they're having major floods again for 2 years because they had 2 years of fires. One of the main things in the city here, as with any city, quite frankly, is the increase in precipitation, rainstorms, and high-level events. This is not where I see this being built into this at all. There's very minor mention of some of these things. I do notice it says focus on the parks and recreation. That's one service. Water supply, that's one service. You mentioned waste management. The core function in waste management is really through the RDN, through the Waste Master Plan, and I was going to recommend that somewhere in here people need to understand governance. Certainly my experience in 15 years in Nanaimo, people have no idea what RDN does. And outside of, and then there's two key areas, there's three I guess. One deals with land use and their strategic plan. In waste management, I mean, they control all the handling, disposal, and all the recycling. Therefore, they have a fair say in the greenhouse gas. Secondly, as far as effluent management and so forth, the sewage treatment is split, I think 96% bill Nanaimo pay, 4% landfill. So Nanaimo really doesn't have much control over the treatment and the processes associated with environmental matters there either. It's much more, though we do have a lot of say, obviously, on the RDN Council. I would suggest that somewhere governance be put in there that brings in the RDN, not necessarily need to be part of the process, but people need to understand this is not all within control of City of Nanaimo. I am concerned that when Council's responsibilities under the Community Charter are really delivery of service and fiduciary duty for the assets, and that's service for everything, and the assets are really only there to provide the service. Yet we seem to want to talk only about a very few of them. And all I heard you really mention in the Climate Action and Resilience Plan was greenhouse gases. And it's way more than that, including the natural assets, because if we don't retain our forests and so forth in climate action, we've got another big problem like Cache Creek has. So I'm not sure the scope of this is big enough to integrate into all the other areas, though I'm very encouraged, at least by the start of the process.
Thanks, Wally.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, actually, I agree enthusiastically, Wally, with your comment. My focus today was on greenhouse gases, but absolutely all of the items you mentioned that fall largely into the adaptation field, and that is equally dear to my heart. And it is something that the official community plan is a high-level document that sets out directions, and there is opportunities in that to add. There's some elements in the official community plan that I didn't touch on today that cover, that touch on many of the things you raised, but all of those can be made better. So, thank you.
You can
Not just CP, if we've got the climate action plan, it needs to be, in my opinion, it needs to cover all of those actions.
All right. Thank you, Wally. I've got Bill, and then Lisa and Rob. Sorry, my brain is switching gears here. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Wally, you made some great points, and David, thanks for your presentation too, but I wanted to advise the group that the fundamental piece of our OCP update, OCP Plus, or whatever you want to call it, is one of the fundamental underlying principles of sustainable service delivery, which speaks exactly to what Wally was saying. And two of the components, as David mentioned, but wasn't the focus of the presentation today, was the active transportation plan, which is really about infrastructure. And then on a larger scale, the water supply strategic plan, which is really a big look about our long-term hydrological health, as well as our the infrastructure, the resilience, and we know, well, here's Jump Lake behind me. We know that's going to be
looks great.
That's going to be a key cornerstone. We're already taking a number of steps that don't need to wait for the OCP to be upgraded, and those just kind of quickly listed them. We're updating our asset management plan over the next couple of years. That's a biggie. And the asset management policy already has that built into to consider natural assets. So that's going to be a fundamental piece of it. And that's as well, that's in council's strategic plan, is to continue or to do a natural asset inventory. And just a brief mention, we're just on the cusp of our manual of engineering standards. We're just kind of going through some more engagement on that. But we've tweaked more than tweaked, we've renovated our rainfall duration curves to account for what we know today of climate change. So that's going to result in larger and more hardened infrastructure for our storm drainage system. And maybe I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Bill. We've got Lisa and then Rob.
Okay. Hi, Wally, and others on the committee. My name is Lisa Bopal-Singh. I'm with Community Planning, and we're part of coordinating this overall Reimagine process. And one of the things I wanted to point out and emphasize is that it might be worthwhile taking a look at the current official community plan that actually surprisingly has quite a lot of climate change aspects addressed throughout, from growth management to residential, where we live, as well as some of the asset management pieces. And one of the other pieces I wanted, for those of you who are less familiar with official community plans, each official community plan must have a regional context statement that links back to the regional growth strategy. And so the regional growth strategy has, one of its key goals is protecting preparing for climate change. And so there's a direct linkage back to that will continue with the revision. One of the guiding principles that Council endorsed for this was climate change. And I think what we see as staff is a good community plan intrinsically embeds climate change within it. And that every aspect considers that throughout all the different pieces that we can look at, from the environmental, the economic, to the social, all the different pieces that we have the ability to address through this comprehensive plan. And then within it, we have all the other plans that can come out in more detail. So there's a good opportunity to build on the existing policies, and I think it's worthwhile taking a look at some of those that are in there that have been implemented since 2008 that have seen, I think, good progress, and things that we want to enhance, things that we want to keep, because going back to our existing plan, they're still working. And I just wanted to point out that we're very aware of that linkage, and we have to keep that linkage to the RDN. And so an updated official community plan will absolutely be linked in with the RDN's growth management strategies and all the different services that they provide for us. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. Thank you.
So I've got Rob and then Jerome.
And briefly, hi Wally, great job on the presentation, Dave. Just to add for information, we have just finished a 2-year process where we have a climate resilience strategy actually that we've developed, and we're going to be taking it to council in the near future. And actually, we speak about it in our next agenda item, because one of the items in the recommendations of the strategy is looking at working with our community stakeholders and other members in the community to raise awareness about climate resiliency and how we can build capacity on a neighborhood level. So that plus a range of recommendations that touch on flooding and drainage, on corporate responsibility, on sea level rise, land and building use. All these are kind of touched on under this strategy, which will be going to council shortly. Just for information, Wally.
Thank you, Rob. Jerome?
Yeah, thanks. Just for clarity, am I understanding correctly, David, that you are also developing the update to the community plan and the transportation plan? And is that all, when you're talking about this integrated approach, is it all your office or your company or whoever is doing this all at once? Or?
The integrated approach is fairly unique, and the team's fairly unique. So Lanark is the prime consultant, but there are 3 to 4 other consultants that are involved. I mentioned C2MP, who are specialists in climate change, both greenhouse gas and adaptation. But there's also City Spaces, who are planners and are assisting with the land use planning and the social side. And then Richard Druell, who is a community transport.
Losing you, David, I think. Or did he freeze?
He's frozen.
I can't see me. He's frozen.
Station planner.
Oh, he's back.
Okay. Checking if I can hear you. Okay. So there's a transportation planner as well, and then we are working very carefully with staff. So all the various departments are fully integrated on this and working together. Oh, that's quite unique. So it's not just me. There are a great number of people that are working on this and actively trying to reduce those stovepipes and actually create a truly integrated result, which I'm very excited about.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. We've got Wally, and then I've got a comment here. Go for it, Wally.
No, I didn't have my hand up again. It's been answered, thanks.
All right, great. I have a question. First off, the slide that you had, the little icons with transportation, solid waste, that had those percentages, like targets. Was that used in the SANAGE plan? That framework of metrics?
Yes, I believe so.
And was Lanark involved in their climate strategy that recently came out?
No, that was C2MP.
Oh, C2MP.
So C2MP are sub to Lanark for this. So they were very much involved in that strategy, and are in Burnaby also ongoing.
Okay, and we have them contracted to do that. Okay.
Through Lanark.
I'm curious what framework they're using. I was recently at a conference, and they were talking that the standards really drew a lot from the Eco-Cities framework and targets, and I'm just curious if that is utilized or at all.
I'll table that one. As I mentioned, I'd want to have Duncan at one of our future meetings, and I'd have to ask him that, and I'm sure he would answer that in a second, but I'll need to table it and take it to him.
Okay. Yeah. So my comment is, I think in large part, this opportunity of doing an integrated plan is that we can really go out to the community and get feedback on what type of targets individuals and people are interested in, and communicate what that means in terms of the options and what we need to do as a community to reach them. And I'd be really interested in being able to put that out to the community and seeing what is the appetite for how much change and action in a suite of different areas. At the city, my understanding is that we have been doing a lot in terms of climate action throughout the years and sustainability, and it's quite baked into our last OCP. And there's many different initiatives right across the board that are happening. The struggle is being able to communicate that to the community. And so we recently have put together a bit of a framework of our climate, of our sustainability actions. And I'm not sure if you've seen that yet, David, but there's 4 different areas around zero waste and energy management, community resiliency, protection, restoration of natural spaces, and climate action. And what I'm hoping is that we can provide options around a set of targets and then options around those targets within that framework and be able to communicate that out. And am I understanding correctly that is really the process of engagement that we're going into, that we're going to be developing options and then bringing that out to the community, getting feedback on that, and that will be linked with targets?
That's absolutely correct, yes. And yes, the greenhouse gas targets, I suggest the information out should talk about alternative targets, but also consequences of alternative targets. Of course, the consequences are worldwide, but we need to also have people understand what's coming and how important action is. But yes, the idea of having information out and listening for current opinion and then going through options and seeing what that does to advance opinion. I imagine opinions may evolve through the process. That's all what we're headed into.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? Jerome, you got your hand up, and Tyler. We'll go to Tyler here because we haven't heard from him, and then to you, Jerome.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Tyler.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for the presentation, David. Nice to see you answered a lot of my questions. One question I sort of have, and I don't know how to sort of structure the question well, so I'm going to do my best here. But whether the regional growth strategy that was referenced or the official community plan, there's often a lot of targets or semi-targets articulated in those plans. Yet, when it comes to things like GHG emissions, well, we've actually gone the other way in terms of the intention of those plans, and emissions have gone up, not just here, everywhere. And I'm just curious how efforts will be made to really define indicators that we can then measure success. It's one thing to say in the plans with the regional growth strategy, hey, this is what we want to do. At what level or what planning level will those indicators sort of be mapped out appropriately, and that way we'll know which policy mechanisms are actually working to achieve some of those and which are not. So for example, we write something into the OCP, it seems to make sense as we're adopting it, but will we be able to make a measurement or have an indication of a measurement a couple of years from now to sort of say, hey, that policy mechanism actually isn't working?
Thanks, Councillor Brown. It's actually quite a good question. A process that we often would use is to be talking about a list of indicators and then working with stakeholders to determine which of those are key indicators, which ones are the ones that give you the best information and maybe represent the rest of the list, because there is a need to focus resources on what you want to measure. But I enthusiastically and supportive of having key indicators. We're a little early to make decisions yet, but one of the discussions that we're having is what might be appropriate in the official community plan, which tends to be a high-level policy document, and what might be appropriate in an action plan or an implementation plan. And then in the implementation plan, I would add, and what would be key indicators of success or failure, and perhaps that's where there are more detailed targets. As you can imagine, the broad general public is probably interested in what are we trying to achieve. Groups like this, which are more technically oriented, will be interested in the meat of how we are going to actually get there. And so we'll be having more detailed conversations with some audiences than with others, and yet we need to talk to everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I know it's a challenging thing to try to sort of navigate and figure out at what stage do you do it. It's just something I'm trying to better understand, and not just, I'm sure we'll be figuring out as we're going, but not just sort of adopt something that looks really good and maybe have platitudes. It's something we can revisit to actually make sure these policy mechanisms are working.
Certainly, we've heard the same points from staff, and we agree. And so when we're working with our technical teams, we'll be raising the idea of what are appropriate indicators and having this discussion.
Thanks so much.
Great, we've got Jerome and then Lisa.
I think you've touched on this, but I just want to be clear on exactly this. Wally kind of started this conversation in the first question, but what we heard in terms of targets, or I'm thinking of those scenarios that you would present to the city as, potential approaches you might take to reduce greenhouse gases. They're all focused on greenhouse gas, and so in our prior discussions of this committee and the meetings that we had, we realized that one of the approaches we did not want to take was to be hyper-focused on greenhouse gas only, which creates the perception that that's all you care about. And it runs the risk of isolating people that view other aspects of climate adaptation or climate change strategy or plan, including preservation of green space. For some people, it's food security. I mean, these are all interlaced, right? For some
yes, they are.
And I just want to make sure that it's, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I guess I think it would be great if the targets were not just greenhouse gas targets. Because it's entirely possible to drive it, like the greenhouse gas can be the tail that wags the entire dog. And there's a risk that you run when you do it that way, I think. And it would be good not to let the other stuff by the wayside as an afterthought. Does that make sense?
It does. It does make sense. And so the words integrated planning are easy to say but hard to do. But what you're leading to is the idea that there's a complex interplay of community values that will create support for certain actions. And when we talk about options, we'll be talking about options across a really, really broad array of environmental and social and climate and economic objectives and aspirations. And the choices in the end will be in balancing all of those things. So I agree. I don't expect the plan to be the greenhouse gas to be the tail wagging the dog. The emphasis today on greenhouse gas was because there's council's climate emergency and it's probably probably going to be one of the most difficult things to achieve in our plan. That's one of our greatest challenges, but I absolutely agree that in the broader public, they'll be considering lots of values, not just that one.
So I wonder, as a quick follow-up, I wonder if the way a way of presenting these options is that, as you said, the greenhouse gas strategy is a multi-decade, if not century strategy that you have to start at some point implementing, knowing that you're basically getting on this train and you're not getting off of it for, generations, basically. That's a very hard sell for a lot of people, just because, we have this trouble forecasting what happens, next week, next month, whatever.
Yes.
And so is there a way of framing those questions or those strategies or those approaches as, here are the short-term goals that would be, say, the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years, and here are the longer-term goals that involve also the greenhouse gas reductions and others? Because in a way, to tell people that we're jumping on this greenhouse gas strategy and framing it within a very short time frame is not realistic, right? And I think it comes back to the idea of saying, what are the metrics? So how do we know if we're doing a good job? Well, this COVID situation, 2 months of greatly reduced mobility across the world and has, barely put a fraction of a percentage dent in the entire CO2 emissions in the world. You can see that in the data. And so you kind of run the risk of burning people out if you pitch it as a short-term strategy. You see what I mean? So it's almost like they have to have coexisting tracks, the one that's within the time span that people can imagine, and the one that is this very long strategy, long game that you're getting onto. Does that make sense?
It does. I think I turn that around to say when we talk about certain actions, I would say, if you want to do an action, you want to increase active transportation because of better fitness, because of better social benefits. We want to change our land use so that's easy to do. We want more shorter trips rather than longer trips. We're seeing a lot of that change. We've seen a lot of apartment builds within our nodes, right, our retail areas in the last 5 years. I mean, there's been huge progress, huge change. All of those are in the right direction. And I think we showcase those changes and just build on them and say, this is the right direction. We're just going to implement more. The greenhouse gas changes come along with many, many, many other values and benefits. And I agree with you, that's the way to present it. But also not to forget that there are dire consequences of not moving fast enough. And so,
absolutely. Yeah. But also not forgetting that we can take all the actions right now. The payoff is not going to be visible. There's a latency in that system that is on a trajectory, and that there's no correcting that trajectory for a while yet, even though we can actually start doing it now, right? And
therefore combining all the different values and benefits together. And so I agree that people will do this for a whole range of variety of reasons, and that's what we need to focus on is all the reasons, not just one.
Okay. Thanks. So we've got Lisa and then Tyler, and then we'll have to move on to subsequent items here. We're going to make it in time, but go ahead.
Okay, so I was going to quickly, in response to Councillor Brown's, Tyler's comment about targets and indicators, the regional growth strategy, of course, does include targets and indicators, and our ability to sync with where they're going when they look at updating their document there is something that we'll be keeping very much aligned with. And then the other piece was to reassure you that very much, although Dave has focused on the GHGs, is that climate change adaptation and resilience is underpinning the whole approach for all of this reimagined Nanaimo process. And in fact, I think somebody mentioned food security. That's currently mentioned in relation to climate change in the existing OCP. So again, what can we do to infuse that adaptive response, knowing that all the changes that we want to make with things like GHGs will take time to come into play, and we're adapting to sea level rise and other things at the same time. So I just wanted to assure you that that's a key underpinning that Council has endorsed the approach that we're taking looking at this. And I think the benefit we have of having this committee start up as we're starting to get this plan going is that we have you for those feedback and checkpoints. So just want to thank you for that.
Lisa, Tyler?
Yeah, thanks. I was going to touch on a couple points, but I think I'm just going to reiterate my concern here is that how we structure indicators are so crucial, because I think the RGS has indicators around lots of interesting things, but I think it looks good when you do a snap point in time, but ultimately they're bogus when it talks about, units built in growth centers, but yet policy mechanisms come in place. This is at the regional level that permit more units outside of growth centers. That's counterintuitive to the actual indicator where, it has, you have X number of affordable units built, but sure, that's great, but it doesn't account for that there's more homelessness on the street now and more housing affordability than ever before. So I think how you structure indicators can be misleading in the story they tell, and I just want to make, and I have confidence here, but I just want to make sure that that's always on top of mind is we're making sure that we're developing meaningful indicators that ultimately don't mislead, and just, it's okay for things not to work because then you can adjust your policy mechanisms. Not everything needs to be a good news story of, hey, we're doing it great. I think it's actually the deviations from that are the most important thing, and we need to get over this fear of thinking ourselves like we're not doing a good job, because it's from those policy failures that we can course correct and actually start to make good policy that is achieving our goals. So if we care about goals, we have to be very honest with ourselves on how we structure indicators. And I think you bring up a really good point. One way I've really seen some large policies framed nicely is when they talk about like a 15-minute neighborhood. So, people can sort of start to relate to a place where you can go to a pub, get your groceries, you can recreate and work, and within a 15-minute walk. That means something to people, but to do that has all these positive benefits around social goals, economic goals, environmental goals that simply talking about how do we lower our GHG emissions through building retrofits that cost X amount of dollars doesn't really resonate with the general public, right? So I totally agree, and I can get a little myopic sometimes in the sense of like we need to achieve things and we need to achieve them quickly, but how you package them and how they speak to people is really crucial. So thanks for bringing that up, and thanks David for the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to wrap this up, I think there is quite a lot of interest in the indicators, and also looking at what are the processes in place that the indicators are reviewed to look at how we're doing, and so that we can track things over time, and then also the communication of indicators and to the public. And what I'm curious is if there's opportunity, and maybe we might review this later on, but where we can have a discussion around to Jerome's point about not run the risk of sort of just sole focus on climate action, but that we're addressing the broad spectrum of sustainability within our environment framework, that we can have a discussion around indicators within that framework here at the committee at a point in the process with the OCP before that is brought out to the community, so that we can review it, discuss it, and then those indicators and options and that can be brought out for community consumption. I don't know if that timing would work, but maybe that's something that we can consider as a motion later on. Sorry, Tyler, do you have one more point to make, or are you? All right, great. We'll move on to the next item here. Thank you, David, greatly for the presentation, the information, and it's a keen crowd here. So thanks for your work, and we're looking forward to the collaboration and integration moving forward.
I'm looking forward to working with you all in the year ahead. So thanks very much. Exciting time. I will leave you for now.
Bye-bye. Have a good coffee.
Thanks.
So, moving on to item 5B.
Sorry, Councillor, just we'll move on. There's our communication.
Oh, that is correct. Bring this up here. So we have a recommendation that the Environment Committee receive the report titled Climate Action Integration within the Reimagined Nanaimo Process. Anybody would like to move that receipt? Go for it, someone. Moved by Tyler, seconded by Wally. All in favor? Carried.
Yep.
Item B, Climate Resiliency Public Engagement Working Group. Rob.
Thanks, Councillor. It's timely, Wally, you brought up the question around resiliency that many committee members may not have known. The city had been working on a climate resiliency strategy process for the last 2 years. Most of the work was kind of centered inward, looking at our departments, our city staff, and our infrastructure, and what we need to do to prepare for climate change going down the road. A number of climate scenarios were developed as part of the process. An engineering study looking at sea level rise and what we might need to do on the policy side and infrastructure side to make improvements was done. And we have a document now with a number of actions and recommendations that we're preparing to take to council. But on one particular issue around how we engage with the community, how we work with the community and communicate what the city is proposing to do, how we communicate the whole concept of climate resiliency is one of those recommendations that's in the study. So as part of that, I'd like to ask if any committee members would be interested in joining me to form a small working group. And my understanding from the rules is it can't be more than a quorum to sit down and have a more focused study around climate resiliency and the document that's going to be going to council shortly, but how we can work better with a number of community stakeholders, with our neighborhood groups, with local business, and how we communicate the issue of climate resiliency, how we build capacity with these various groups, and kind of move forward on that issue on a wider level than what we are currently doing through simply the city being the primary actor, but getting other players in the community involved as well. That's my overview.
Any questions for Rob? Joel?
Rob, I'm wondering how, when I read that, I was surprised by it, because it seems to me that how can we be putting together a working group on a topic that we don't really know what it's going to work on yet? And I know there are some aspects of it that are already existing, but clearly what we heard from David before is that all of these components have to be integrated into an overall series of plan, including a climate action plan that itself is quite diverse in terms of how it overlaps with different the existing strategies and groups of the city. So I guess what I'm wondering is, are we not sort of putting the cart before the horse a little bit? Just that it's a good idea to have a working group, but how can we really be getting the most out of that group if you set it up until you actually have some idea of where this climate action plan is going to take you?
I think, can I respond?
Yeah.
I think I can, I should say this has had its own kind of history to get to this point, and like I say, it's been about 2 years to go through this, but, and I don't think we're saying as well that we have to have the engagement strategy ready in a short period of time, but I think it's important to get input from the committee and others in the community, and whether that's also about talking about how we can integrate our work with the OCP update. I mean, that can be part of the conversation, but I'm looking at this point for some input as part of this, and we can go into more in depth about what the climate resiliency strategy has right now and how better it could be integrating with the overall OCP update that's about to start as well. So I hope that answers your question. I'm just saying, what I'm looking for is some help for some participation with your perspectives, but I see this as going on for a few months, as we start to work and kind of grapple around with what we have done to date and what we need to kind of start thinking about to improve how we communicate with the community around this issue. And whether we're overlapping or integrating with the OCP process, I think that's fine.
So then what's the feedback, what's the mechanism by which whatever you do in the next few months will be fed back into the entire process of revising these plans, because those are basically on target for almost a year from now, 10 or 11 months from now.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, and so,
I mean, I guess what I'm thinking is, are we setting up a parallel track that basically goes off on its own and doesn't sort of feed into the entire strategy, which seems to be having most of its value in the fact that it's going to be integrative of everything?
now I think there's opportunities to take advantage of the community input the process that's part of the OCP update, but keep in mind what we're trying to create, what kind of programs and actions we're trying to develop is going to go beyond the actual whole process for the OCP update on climate resiliency. What do we need to do to kind of raise awareness about the city's programs and policies around climate resiliency? What do homeowners need to do to think about flooding and drainage control, or dealing with high heat events or something like that for vulnerable populations? I guess there's a lot of different issues that kind of center around a lot of things around health, around land use, around social policy that we can be looking at as we go through this. And you're right, we don't want to be going off in a different direction from the OCP process. There will be some opportunity to overlap, but at the end of the day, these are things that are going to go on and continue on afterwards, after the OCP is done.
So, I guess I think I kind of need specifics. Can you give us an example of where you think, or one of the examples of the items of climate resiliency where you would, what would that interaction with the public look like? What would you like to get out of them? If you think about the flooding situation or the extreme heat event, what is it that you would like in terms of the interaction with people that would give you some feedback or some interaction that helps you in that process? Because I'm not clear on that.
Well, I guess it's things like the health authority, the school district, for example. Are there things we need to coordinate more effectively if there's an extreme weather event, high heat days, localized flooding that we need to think about as far as coordinating resources or providing like cooling spaces for high heat events, or when there's a localized forest fires, so the air quality level drops. Are there things and services the city can offer that we need to better coordinate? And potentially this is partly an emergency management question as well, and they would be a player in this. But I mean, those are just a couple of examples.
Okay.
Bill?
Can't hear you, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just wanted to further a little bit to what Rob was saying. I think one thing that we started grappling with was the sea level rise study, and the way the study has come about. We're just not sure how best to bring that forward to the public, and I think we were hoping to get some engagement or some support from the committee or a subgroup to help us wrap our head around that. We don't want to be alarming, but we don't want to be withholding information either. And so it's translating the very science-based version of the sea level rise study into something that's digestible and understandable and transparent.
So I assume that this is what this committee was for. To me, this committee is this kind of working group, no?
Wally?
Jerome?
Oh, we'll go to Wally here first, Jerome, and if you got more to say, back in.
Hey, thank you. This is an area we have wrestled with for some time and spent the last several years on, and continue with our communications consultant on engaging people in asset management. We've learned a lot of lessons, and I think maybe that's some of the things you're talking about. But there's different ways you talk to different people, and Jerome, you brought up earlier about not getting too high with the public and coming down to some of the very areas that address them. That's what we've really had to come to in a number of these areas, is how do we get into people's heads with things that are important to them? And I know I could certainly bring some of those lessons to the table we've learned over the past 3 or 4 years on the asset management side. In fact, we basically made the decision we're not going to talk to the public about asset management, because they really talk to their councils about, they don't have to come up to the councillor and say, do asset management. They come up and want to talk about service and costs. Asset management's a process to help you get there. So that was one of the fundamental decisions we really made. We were making a big mistake trying to educate a person who didn't want to or need to be educated. So I think there are a number of things that maybe can be helpful up front, and how do we phrase this? And Bill was saying, what's the strategy to talk to the public about Horizon Oceans? These things are difficult things, and we tend to talk in our own language. It's been taking us some time to really get out of that and understand how we need to talk to the public. So maybe that's one area that this group could address.
So I'm going to interject here. I'm hearing the points made by Jerome just about having the two tracks, focusing on climate resiliency and then also this OCP process. I think that in general, a need for a working group around communication of the environment, all aspects of sustainability, I think that needs to happen. I think that there is obvious need for it specifically on the climate resilience strategy, and that's something that might have more immediate need right now and a more direct conversation, but also these other conversations need to happen. And I'm curious if we can establish a working group, like if we change the recommendation to engage with the public on the issue of the environment, and then that working group, first off, it can be on climate resiliency and working on those issues to bring to the committee, and then have that working group also address other conversations around our wider framework and strategy moving forward to the OCP.
It kind of comes back to Jerome's point, though, about is the Environment Committee the working group in itself, and I guess what I was trying to do is in a formal setting, in a little more of an informal setting, have a bit of a conversation with some of the community stakeholders who were involved in our process, provide some, basically kind of go through the recommendations and get a little more meat and detail about how best we could be better communicating resiliency around sea level rise, around some of the emergency management that we could be doing with some of the partners like the health authority, like the school district, and then come back with more of a clearer package that the larger committee could look at. And this might be later in the fall, for example. But you know what? That was my proposal anyway. So, but I'm open.
Any
Mr. Chairman, can I just jump in on a couple of comments and just follow up maybe more on what Bill said and tie in what Rob said? I want to be clear about when we head off and do major work like the OCP, we often do a bunch of foundational work leading up to that review. And historically, those things are like population projections, land capacity analysis. This time, I would see that the climate resiliency strategy is one of those key formative works that's been done to get a better understanding on what are the impacts of climate change on the community. So we're modeling our different options. We're able to consider those and whatever policy objectives we come up with under the OCP. So it's good timing to have that document in place. And we're also careful in the report to acknowledge what Jerome's talking about is that there's a separate process going on and we don't want to be outside of it. So very much we would see the working group having a connection to that group and to the engagement strategy that's been created around the OCP. That would be critical. But back to what Bill's saying, my understanding or my thoughts, because we brought this here and ended up on your work plan, was really about what Bill's talking about is how do we help convey, leading up to the OCP, how do we help take this technical data that we have, this story that we have, and how do we put it in a way that the community can respond to and not come across like fear-mongering, but come across like we're actually trying to openly share information so that people start off on a level playing field when they start contributing to our engagement process in the OCP. So I think just a couple of things I wanted to clarify.
So this is communicating key foundational data that is going to greatly impact how the public perceives subsequent information on options and that for the OCP that they need to understand going into it.
And the reason I don't want to hang Rob out like it was his idea alone to do the steering committee, the working group, because I was very much in favor of that because of what Rob spoke to is it gives an opportunity for a more informal setting where you can invite other people to the table, but also because I thought I heard from a couple of members on this committee who were very interested in this area of work where it might not be the level of detail that everybody wants to get into, but absolutely whatever this working group come up with would come back to this table for a more fulsome discussion and review before it ever went to council. So it's ultimately your process, it's your document. If you want to have the whole discussion involving everybody here at the table, that's fine. It's just a different model to get there.
Yeah, I personally think working groups are a very important model to utilize, and so I think that addressing the broader issues is going to happen, and this is something that needs to happen right now. So I would be here for Jerome and Wally, and then I'd be open to hearing somebody to move in this recommendation. Jerome and then Wally.
I'll keep it really short. I mean, I appreciate the discussion because it clarifies exactly what the intent is. And my impression is that, A, you want to avoid burning people out on, consultation, whatever that looks like. And I think that any consultation you do, when you bring up those complex issues of sea level rise and what the impact might be, and you're trying to avoid fear-mongering, at the same time you're trying to be transparent, they carry more weight, and I think they lead to more tangible actions if they can be backed by an overall strategy. So if the climate action plan says there's a risk of sea level rise, damage, or whatever it might be in some parts of the city, and the city is therefore, implementing these policies to mitigate those risks, then that discussion has like a vehicle behind it to really lead to tangible actions. And I think that's where you're going to get the most bang for your conversation with people. Other than just presenting it now, let's start the discussion, and it says, well, then where does it lead us? Mm-hmm. And so if you've got a clear path in terms of where it leads you, because you've got an entire document behind it that frames why you're doing this, then I think it has a lot more value, right?
Thank you.
So I'm not against the idea, I just think it has to be pitched properly.
Yep. Wally, Elise, and then we'll move on here. Go for it, Wally.
No, I'm okay. I think I made my point before.
All right, thanks. Elise?
Everyone, so it seems like we really care about how the public perceives us. And I think obviously there's a larger plan, which not everyone's going to take time to look at and fully understand everything. So I think in order to make it digestible to the public, I really encourage it to be beautifully presented, and by that I mean in art to community. Is important messages with people with iconography, for example. I think that's a really important thing and a really effective thing that isn't always used into plans and documents, but has a lot of power. And secondly, to just really consider when we say this is a potential result that might happen such a sea level rise, just empowering people. Yes, the city is doing this. They're working with all of these different organizations, but also sharing with something that each individual or small unit of family can do to link into how everything's connected. Because if people are really scared by something large, it can make them feel paralyzed. But now allowing them and employing them to actually take an action will help something that is a very great thing to do for their mental health and for the sake of community.
Thank you, Elise.
I think you're kind of hitting it on the head, actually. I mean, that's one of the outcomes I was kind of thinking. It's taking it from this huge scale and bringing it down to something, to a human scale. Like what can an individual do and what's within their control that they're able to manage in their own lives, and trying to communicate that story as well. I mean, the city will do what it needs to do as far as protecting its infrastructure and the community as a whole, but what can individuals, what can neighborhoods, what can businesses do as well? What is the role that they can play? What can we do to help empower them to also have a role in this? And I think that's kind of what I was thinking about as well to drive this.
Great. Anybody interested in moving the recommendation?
Dave Bennett, I don't have the ability to raise a little hand.
Oh, sorry. You raised your voice. Go for it.
Thank you. I would happily move the recommendation, and the reason, and I will, and the reason why is I think a lot of what we're talking about is probably the issues, the concerns, and ultimately the intention behind having a working group, having these conversations, and trying to figure out the best way to move these items forward.
All right.
So I will move the recommendation.
Seconded. All in Any discussion? I just got one point. Oh, okay.
So regarding the working group, so I need to clarify myself. So it's in your mind, it's a temporary
Yes,
working group,
temporary.
or just focus on to prepare a plan, short term.
Correct.
So the purpose to establish this group, just you want to hire some specialist or whatever.
No, it's
Why we cannot do ourselves, like you or some employee?
I think it's important to work with the committee and basically take advantage of your expertise and background. And also there were lots of different community groups that were also involved at various points that I think we could bring back and have conversations about how, it's about communication, it's about how do we identify what we can do as an individual, as a business, as a neighborhood around climate resiliency, knowing what's expected to happen in the future, and trying to come up with a strategy about how to share that information, and also how to, I guess it's really about empowering, giving people an opportunity to kind of take more control and come up with some ways for them to kind of take action themselves. And I think that's where it'll go. It's like a communication strategy.
Do we have ideas of how much we will spend?
Well, one thing I could do is I can help with put together a short terms of reference, something that kind of gives some clarity on how long I would expect the working group to function, and I could have that ready for July for the next committee.
This year, July.
Yeah, just next month. So it'll just clarify what we've talked about and what I kind of see as the time limit for the group, and a little bit of a work plan that I can see how we can kind of come to the conclusions. But in a lot of ways, this is an opportunity for the committee to kind of, really get into this as well, of course, and bring their own knowledge, their own expertise into this as well. So I'm hoping this works out for everyone. I do have a reminder though that we can't have a quorum in this working group. So we're only looking for a couple of people, 2-3 people. Just to keep that in mind.
And Lindsay, are you there on the call? I know there was some interest by you in something of this nature. Just curious if you had any comments.
I do, yeah, thank you. I let Rob know earlier today that I was interested for sure, and I continue to be. Sorry, I'm muted and sort of blocked off because my kids are all around me. And that's not, the most professional thing. So, I think this is a really good idea, and I want to go forward with it, if not only to, figure out ways to communicate to the public, which I really appreciated what Jerome and Elise have been saying, and Wally too, about the meaningfulness of this, and also hopefully to still gather some of that baseline data that we've been talking about quite a bit, about some of the more psychosocial variables that I think would be really good, if not done by the consultants, because I don't know what exactly they're planning to ask. But just for us and the city to have at our fingertips to track over time some of the variables that we might want to measure about perceived safety, sense of place, organizational commitment, and other things we've talked about before. So I think that could come up in the working group too, maybe ways to do that off to the side and just keep that data in our hands to track, because it would be another indicator too about how well some of the changes that we're making environmentally in the city through the OCP and the other changes to the plan, we can track for ourselves how well they're working on a psychological level using environmental sites. So that's a good idea.
Excellent. So what I would say in terms of, we are limited to a certain number on the working group, but to 4. So if you are interested, email Tyler and I, and we'll figure out, and if we have to maybe rotate through or something like that, we'll do that. But we are limited to a certain number of people. So yeah, please send us an email and we'll go from there if you're interested. So all in favor of the recommendation?
Yeah,
Right?
I am.
Carried. Item C, BC Energy Step Code rezoning policy. Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is this is actually an item on the committee's work plan that was specifically directed there by council, and council directions provided in the fall. You can read through the report. There's some details on the background. I'll just give a really brief overview and then just highlight the proposed policy that's included. There's a draft policy included in the report. So this is coming out of the city's step code implementation strategy. Hopefully, can everybody hear me okay? Hopefully I'm coming through okay. Yeah, okay, thanks. So July 2018, the city adopted a step code implementation strategy. Just give a little bit of background on what the BC Energy Step Code is for any of you that may not be aware. So it's something that was developed by the province, and at the moment it's a voluntary incremental incentive that municipalities can either require or use it as an incentive to augment the basic requirements of the BC Building Code, to require increased or to incent or require increased building energy efficiency. The province has set out a timeline targeting net zero ready energy efficient buildings for new builds by 2032. So they're targeting net zero by 2032. They've got a timeline. The province has adopted a timeline for implementation of the step code. The city has, as I mentioned, as of 2018, adopted a step code implementation strategy. There were a number of elements to the strategy. I'm just going to touch on a couple of them briefly that have already been implemented. One of them was actually bringing the requirement for step code into the building bylaw. So as of April 21st, based on a council adoption of changes to the building bylaw in the fall, as of April 21st, 2020, step 1 of the BC Energy Step Code is required for all Part 9 and Part 3 buildings. So Part 9 buildings are smaller buildings. Part 3 buildings are sort of larger, more complex buildings. So as of April 21st, 2020, so fairly recently, minimum requirement for BC for energy efficiency in buildings in the city of Nanaimo is step 1 of the step code. So that's a requirement. On top of that, as part of the BC Energy Step Code implementation strategy the city adopted, council also introduced incentives into the zoning bylaw. Zoning bylaw Schedule D has density bonusing incentives that are, it's a whole suite, a range of options, I guess, that developers can take depending on the site, depending on the development, the nature of the development, to access additional density beyond the base density that's permitted in zoning. So as part of an incentive that helps to incentivize increased building energy efficiency, council at the same time in the fall adopted as part of the zoning bylaw Schedule D density bonusing provisions a step code requirement there, a step code option there that developers can access, and those are laid out on page in tables. The timelines and options there are laid out on tables on page 76 of the agenda. So there's a requirement under the building bylaw already. There's an incentive under the zoning bylaw for increased building energy efficiency. Another item that was in the step code implementation strategy was for the city to look at adopting a rezoning policy. And that's what's proposed in this report. The rezoning policy, as it's proposed, is fairly simple, straightforward. I think hopefully it's understandable based on the information provided in the report. But as it's proposed, so any rezoning that's proposed, rezoning application, if this council policy were adopted, and this is right now, we're just bringing it forward to the committee for consideration of endorsement or recommendation on revisions, and then it would proceed to council after that. But if it were adopted by council, the policy would require a project that went through rezoning, development on a property that went through rezoning to exceed the minimum requirement in the building bylaw by one step. So currently, the building bylaw requires step 1 of the BC Energy Step Code. Somebody comes in, this policy were adopted by council, somebody comes in to rezone a property, we're going to require that they meet one step above that. As it's important to note too that the step code, as the tables outline on page 76, there's incremental increase in the energy efficiency requirements in the building bylaw currently. So as of, for instance, I mentioned as of April 21st, 2020, step 1 is the minimum requirement. As of January 1st, 2021, there's a requirement that buildings achieve, smaller buildings, Part 9 buildings, achieve a minimum of step 2, in which case if somebody were to rezone a property to develop, they would then have to achieve step 3. So this policy would require increased building energy efficiency for properties that have been rezoned, one step above the minimum required by the building bylaw, and that would increase over time towards ultimately the target of net zero energy ready buildings by 2032 that the province has outlined. So hopefully that provides enough information for the committee to understand what's proposed here. There are options, as I mentioned. The committee recommendation is that the committee endorse the policy as drafted. The option also obviously is always available for the committee to provide recommendations, revisions to the proposed policy, or recommend revisions to the proposed policy, and those options are outlined on page 77 of the agenda. And but the recommendation at this point is to endorse the policy as presented.
Thank you, Jeremy. Any questions? I have a question. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Sure. Hey, thanks, Ben. It's Tyler. I just have a question for you to staff. I'm just curious, was it looked at to just actually accelerating the actual adoption timeline? So, I think it's 2022 after that, so has that data to be determined? And I'm just curious if it was looked at accelerating that schedule, or if that schedule was flushed out with more detail.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Councillor Brown. I can speak to that. So that's a separate item actually on the committee's work plan, and as directed by council to accelerate review or potentially accelerate the implementation of the Energy Step Code. Right now, as adopted, the requirements that the city's included in the building bylaw take us to basically to step 3 at January 1st, 2022 for Part 9 buildings, and step 2 as of January 2022 for Part 3 buildings. So that's actually the schedule that was outlined. We haven't gone beyond 2022, January 2022. We haven't gone beyond step 2 for Part 3 buildings or step 3 for Part 9 buildings. That's on the schedule that was recommended by the province. There's definitely opportunity for the city to look at accelerating that. Council's directed the Environment Committee to consider that, and we would be bringing forward a report at a future committee meeting to consider accelerated implementation of the BC Energy Step Code as it sits right now. This is sort of a separate piece to that.
Great.
Okay, so just to be clear, this isn't, so is this policy resulting from the council motion to send this to committee, and is just 2 items being brought forward separately, or are you saying there's another report coming with potential accelerated options separate from this?
Yes, it was separate direction from council. One actually relates to the original Step Code implementation strategy. This current rezoning policy ties back to the original Step Code implementation strategy. So that's just following through on the existing Step Code implementation strategy. The second resolution direction from council was to, and it's on the committee's work plan, to bring forward consideration of accelerated implementation of the step code. So this piece would sort of, I guess, finalize the existing step code implementation strategy. And then council has subsequently directed the committee consider accelerating the step code implementation strategy.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah.
Great. So I have a question. So I have a question regarding this, the DC target from the step code. We have the general target. So by 2032, actually it's not far from this year, just 12 years away. So we need to achieve, the net zero energy ready. What does it mean? So it's hard for me to imagine is a net zero energy. That means no energy consumption for all new buildings. What does it mean? How can we achieve that?
So
we have to use heating, right? We need to use the hydro to cook.
So is there technologies that can be integrated into the building that generate energy themselves and actually kind of offset the energy demand that might be going in for cooking or heating? And I think that's part of what this is about, is designing and building buildings that can kind of provide ultimately a net zero kind of balance between the energy brought in, but also potentially what energy can be saved by the design and construction of the building, and perhaps any energy that could be generated from the building site too.
That means
generally.
Then all the new building need to generate energy. Like use the solar energy. How do we generate so much energy
or minimize the amount of energy it needs to function through enhanced energy, through insulation, through better building design?
I think the first thing is in concept, what does it mean is net zero energy? For my understanding, it doesn't consume energy. Just from outside, import.
Yeah, Jerome just had a comment, sort of. So what is meant by it is that what he wrote, it means that energy consumed is offset by any production.
Offset.
So yeah, you could produce energy. To offset the energy that it consumes. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, just because I think it's important to know that this isn't a City of Nanaimo initiative to move all of our new buildings to net zero. This is a provincial initiative that we're following along as everywhere across at least the majority of the province. So
yes,
it's part of a much bigger directive.
Yeah, maybe I could add a little bit of clarification too. So it's like as Mr. Lindsay's mentioned, it's part of a broader provincial initiative, and it's part of the Clean BC plan, and so it's part of the province's climate mitigation plan, and they've and it's important to note too, it's not prescriptive. So there's many different technologies, many different approaches that builders could use, and building science is working on, has created to achieve net zero buildings. So there are net zero buildings that exist now, and the industry idea is that we will incrementally build up capacity in the industry to create much more energy efficient buildings, leading towards net zero by 2032. If that helps. Yeah.
And these requirements will be in the building code itself.
That's good.
So I think the cost of the house could be up.
Yeah. Yeah, there's, if I could again too, the province has been modeling and working with, the province is also working with, building code, the regulatory side, and also working with the building science side. And they're coming up with, they're doing modeling and they're working with industry to reduce, minimize the cost implications and to develop building science technology that deals with building energy efficiency well, and this is incremental over time. Industry will evolve to hopefully they'll be producing much more energy efficient buildings at not a significantly higher cost.
So what's the real purpose to achieve the net zero energy? Is it just for reduce the GHG emission?
Correct. Yeah, that's essentially, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And I think, we can send more information to you on the BC program, just so that you can get a bit more detailed understanding, but just in the interest of time, we should probably...
Yeah, I once read the step code, the BC energy step code.
Yeah.
For me, it's pretty rough anyway, so
Yeah.
it's not that detailed, but they list the general target. So
Yeah.
then, yeah.
As the chair mentioned too, any committee members would be happy to provide more background information and links to information if you want to better understand the BC Energy Step Code.
Yeah. Great. Anybody willing to move the recommendation?
Maybe not.
Go for it, somebody.
Any other questions?
Any other questions? I think.
I'll move the recommendation.
Thank you. Seconded by Wally. All in favor? Carried.
Like your toilet flush.
Item D, Green Fleet Strategy. Presented by Mr. Sims.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been playing around with PowerPoint and trying to get it to show, but for some strange reason it won't show, so I'm going to just scroll through the screens as needed. And I will need to share, so if I have your permission, I will do that. All good?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Your new ride.
So, there's a new ride. That's the green seat strategy that we're having. So just wanted to briefly give the committee an overview of the city's green fleet strategy, and this is a reprise of the presentation we gave to council on May the 11th. And at that point in time, council adopted the city's green fleet strategy. So the why of why we did a green fleet strategy was transportation is really a part of the corporate GHG emissions. And so we've been working for a decade or more on greening the fleet and right-sizing it, but this really brings it together. The main focus on the strategy is for reducing emissions, managing our costs and expenses, and continually improving. So this kind of goes back a way. We had a fleet manager who unfortunately was pulled back to the siren song of southwestern Ontario for family. We spent this a year and a half, but really brought us, in a very coordinated and progressive way a lot further with our public works fleet. We have about 450 pieces of equipment, vehicles, and so on and so forth that we manage. And it's a major cost for the city as well as a major emitter of greenhouse gases. So there's been various initiatives over the years, as I mentioned. So the Fraser Basin Council, now I think it's called Richmond Sustainability Initiatives, has got this E3 fleet, which stands for Energy, Environment, and Excellence. The E3 fleet program, and so council, we presented to council about a year ago, And then they were enthusiastically endorsing us to join that and participate in the review. So we did that, worked with the E3 fleet group to run through that sort of level 1, they call it, which looks at a good large sampling of the fleet, and then talks about the fuel efficiencies and distances and so forth, develops a number of recommendations. Level 2 and 3 get into much more capital and asset approach. So the other little service that the E3 provides us is a rating service. So we went through that rating service as well, and were awarded silver, and I believe we're the only municipality on the island that is rated at all, let alone that silver. Fortis is the other fleet provincially that is rated, but other than that, there's no other fleets, I believe, on the island. So this kind of, yes, it's a trophy, but it kind of gives us a bit of a rallying point or something to strive for. We'd like to get to gold and maybe eventually platinum, but it allows us to sort of demonstrate that we're improving as we go. So the cornerstone of the green food strategy is really reducing fuel consumption, looking at alternative fuels, and then looking at electrifying the city's fleets, including that whole bit around infrastructure. So there's a number of, the reducing fuel consumption piece is really around culture. So changing and improving driver behavior. So we've had an anti-idling policy in place for probably 12 years now. And it's there, and we sort of cycle it into crew talks once in a while, but it's not sort of targeted. So the driver training piece of this is really about changing that behavior and really having somebody to whip the drivers and start to modify behavior. And then, so that includes everything like the green procurement piece of that is right sizing. So our former fleet manager that sort of developed the right sizing form. So if you ask me what kind of vehicle I need to go ahead and read meters, I'll say, well, I need a 3/4 ton pickup truck, 4x4, yeah, that would be great. But the intent really is to go, well, what is it you're using? What's your needs? Well, here's the vehicle we're looking at. And the trend in vehicles, of course, for us is looking at life cycle costing is going electric, going small, going fit for purpose. We still have to operate it as a municipality. You can't pick up garbage in a Prius, but at the same time, there's a lot of vehicles that we can get right sized. The alternative fuels piece is really CNG, our compressed natural gas, is our fleet of sanitation, our garbage and recycling vehicles is all CNG, and so that's a huge improvement. We're looking at propane. We've already done quite a number of propane conversions. We've got propane in the yard. We've shifted to biodiesel, and for summertime use, we're going to 20% biodiesel, which is quite an upgrade from efficiency and GHG perspective. What else can I tell you on that? And the last one is on the electrification and just having a corporate ownership of a charging network for all of the electrical vehicles that will definitely be moving towards. And I missed it. Well, these are hidden slides, I think, maybe, but this is the downside of scrolling. So this just kind of gives you an overall overview of the city's GHG targets, and this is an overall the entire city. But just to note that the fleet has quite a large role to play in it, and we just in the last week or so received notification about the CO2 equivalent credit that we're getting for having a green bin composting program, as an example, and that's equivalent to 3,500 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So that's not necessarily fleet, but it's something that we use our fleet for. So having that program in place is almost 50% or more of our current reductions. And just my last slide talks about the distribution of emissions across the city's vehicles. So 22% using alternative fuels and 29% is using biodiesel. That's really the end, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments. Yeah.
Any questions for Bill?
So I have a question regarding the alternative for the gasoline. So as I know, outside of Canada, a lot of the countries just use LNG. Here, we just use the CNG. So do you know what's the reason? Yeah.
The rating of
The CNG, why we don't use the LNG, just a liquefied natural gas. But here, as I know, our bars just use the CNG, the compressed natural gas. Right? So actually, we have a storage of LNG just near the Nanaimo, is Lady Smith. Yeah. 40 species.
There's a large liquefied natural gas storage reservoir on Mount Hayes, south of town, but the distribution network is really it's aerated form of natural gas. So we're plugging in essentially to the natural gas network, compressing it, and that's what we're hooked up to. We don't have ready access to liquefied.
To LNG.
Yeah.
If we change it to LNG, I understand we need to invest to build the station, the fuel station, and change the car. Yeah, we need to use the LNG tank, not the CNG tank.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Somebody willing to move the recommendation or the receipt of information? Moved by Wally, seconded Jerome. All in favor? Carried. On other business, I do have one item that I would like to raise, just sort of on the earlier discussion on performance indicators. And put this out for discussion first, and then we entertain a motion. But in terms of what the consultant was speaking about and the interest in indicators, I'm curious if we could have an opportunity to have some indicators brought forward for the full, already a lot of them exist in that framework that was sent out, and they're within the Act of Transportation. But there may potentially could be some gaps, but I think that would be useful to have those indicators come to a list of indicators for each category of the environmental framework to come to the committee, and maybe in collaboration with the consultant for the committee to review and discuss before that is brought out to the community. And I'm not sure exactly on the timing of that, but I'm curious thoughts on that. Because I would like to move that's brought here for discussion.
I do recall in the presentation from the consultant that there was going to be fairly early in the process an opportunity to kind of talk about, I think, it was more than an engagement. It was really looking at some of the technical information and then coming up with a kind of a list of accommodations. I'm just trying to think where it is in the list here. It was on a slide, but my feeling was when that was brought up, that could be an opportunity where indicators are kind of interjected into the conversation at that point and what role they're going to play. Because I think developing indicators will take time, and I think as the conversation earlier on was indicating, we need to really think about the type of indicator we choose and something that's effective and meaningful. And I think that will take a fair bit of work and research, especially considering all the plans that are being updated at the same time and how they integrate with each other going forward. So it may be a fairly significant task to try and come up with those indicators, and I think it has to be more embedded into the OCP update process, at least in my opinion.
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, are you asking for a motion to bring back draft indicators that are developed through this process to the committee for review and comment?
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to make that motion, we'll make sure that happens.
Right. I'll move that motion.
Just for clarity, Councilor Gaspar, what you're proposing is beyond just the climate related. You're speaking more to the categories defined in that framework that was presented at the last meeting?
Yeah, so, the intent would be like the staff prepare key performance indicators for each category of the environmental framework to bring to the committee for discussion and consideration. The precise wording that Dale used in terms of how the mechanics work, but it would be indicators for each category of the framework that we could review and discuss, prepping that to go to the public.
I understand now.
Yeah. And I think I just want to reemphasize that when council started off on this process, we as staff put some suggested guiding principles in front of council, and one of the ones that council added was they wanted to make sure at the end of the day that whatever we developed had some measurables in it. So I think this is an important part of that discussion. So absolutely happy to do that, Mr. Chair.
I'll second it. No one else?
Any discussion, comment? Oh, Jerome?
I think we've largely been covered. I think you can't think indicators until you have outcomes in mind, and outcomes will come out of some of the plans. So I think any sort of iterations of these reviews and these plans that come through from the consultant will be needed to have a look at some point and then evaluate the indicators that we've discussed so many times. So yeah, I think that's a very good motion. I would support entirely.
Wally?
Yeah, we deal with a lot of local governments that are data rich, and I think it's an excellent idea to bring it forward because we really need to understand what the indicator tells us. I've seen so many indicators that are reported for the sake of reporting them, but they tell you nothing. And that discussion is really very important, I think, to say why are we having this indicator, what does it tell us, what do we want to do with. So that discussion, I agree with Jerome, is very, very important.
Excellent. Any further comment? All right, all in favor?
Yeah, favor.
Motion carried. Great, and that brings us, folks, to the end of the meeting. Anyone would like to make a motion for adjournment? Moved by Jerome, seconded by Wally. All in favor? Thank you, everyone, for a great meeting.
They're just adjourning, ending the meeting.
Have a good rest of your day.